Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Julia Madison, and I will be the technical manager for this session today on navigating the complexity of child malnutrition in South Africa, the Nourished Child photo exhibits, chaired by Scott Jermy. So thank you all so much for taking part in ANH 2022. We look forward to a really robust and interactive session today. A quick reminder that everything you might need to access conference materials and the program can be found on the ANH Academy website at anh-academy.org/ANH2022. So before the team takes the conversation forward, I just have a few technical announcements to ensure our experience is as smooth and interactive as possible. So first, this session is being recorded and will be posted on the ANH Academy website following the conference. Second, all participants have been muted, but please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat box. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and the organization that you work with. We encourage you to share your webcam video feed during the session, but if your connection is bad, we recommend turning the video off. Later in the session, we will open up opportunities for question and answer, but if you have questions throughout the session, please drop them in the chat box. And lastly, if you experience any technical issues, please check your audio settings and your internet connection. You can always try to reconnect to the session using the same Zoom link you used to join now. But if you have any other technical questions, please send me a private message using the chat box. So thank you all so much again for joining this session, and I'm going to hand it over to Karina to get us started.
Great, well, thank you. Really good to be here, and thanks very much for joining this session. I'm Karina Hawkes, and I'm a principal investigator of the Nourished Child study that we'll be talking about today as the basis of this learning lab. And I'd like to thank the fantastic team that is part of that study at the University of Cape Town: Jane Battersby, Joe Hunter Adams, and Gareth Haytham; at the University of Stellenbosch, Scott Grimmy, Lisa Engelbrecht, and Lysander Plessy; UNICEF, as well as the Western Cape Department of the Premier, Tristan Gorgon. So thanks very much. That is the team. So the background to this Nourished Child study is the double burden of malnutrition in South Africa, which of course is a problem all over the world, and particularly a serious problem in South Africa with young children, with adults consuming diets which lack adequate diversity for health and development, which lack sufficient micronutrients, which don't enable healthy growth, combined with a kind of epidemic of junk food, of ultra processed foods, and high fat foods. And so this combination is leading to this problem. And what's interesting about the case of South Africa, as colleagues will, my South African colleagues who've led this study and the work in this study, is that South Africa already has a lot of policies and strategies, which have shown some benefit and some promise, but haven't translated into large improvements. And one of these is the Child Support Grant, which is a really important aspect of social protection in South Africa, and which doesn't keep everybody out of hunger by any means, as recent data has shown, unfortunately, but does play an important role in addressing poverty, with implications for malnutrition, but still it's not really clear exactly what impact it has. And that's one of many different measures that have been taken nationally, as well as at the provincial and at the city level in South Africa, including restrictions on levels of salt, including a sugary drinks tax, including school efforts made in schools, and a range of other actions for very young children, awareness campaigns, and so on. But despite this, and the amount of research that's gone into this problem, the problem persists, and stunting, for example, has been very persistent. Obesity has been growing and is at this very high levels, particularly amongst women. So what we try to do in this piece of work is to say, how can we better understand and better define a really comprehensive and holistic approach to addressing this problem? What would it look like? And that's what we call a systems approach. What would this systems approach look like? That means that action is taken in an urban setting. Sorry, I should have said at the start, it's set in very urban settings. What is the role of the food system? What is the role of the urban system? What is the role of the health system? What's the role of the education system? And thinking about all of these different systems, the social system as well, the social service system, about what actions can be taken in each of these different systems, and why is it that action in one system that appears to be a positive action, such as actions taken in the Road to Health booklet, which tries to support provide information for the early years, why that might be being undermined by what's happening in the food system. So to try and understand this from a multiple systems perspective. But what's important about that is to say that we need to start with the place where those systems are actually experienced. And that is the lives of people who experience the problem. So as we'll be talking about in this learning lab, the systems approach matters, but also the lived experience methods and the way of gaining evidence of lived experience and what that can help tell us about how systems need to change, as opposed to saying, well, we know systems need to change, we know that, so let's try and change these systems by understanding it from the outside. No, we want to understand it from the perspective of the people who experience that system, and that's what this learning lab is about is about today. So I will now hand over, and I also just wanted to add that I'm not the only person at the Centre for Food Policy working in this study. I wanted to acknowledge my colleague Mark Spires as well, so I to not mention you first thing in the mention. So over to you, Jane. Oh, yeah, Jane.
Right, hello everybody. I was going to say good afternoon, but I'm looking at the audience and I'm realizing that we are from all corners of the earth. So good day, whatever time of day it is to you. So my name's Jane Battersby and I'm part of the research team based at the University of Cape Town. And I'm really going to talk you through this lived experience methods and the way in which we thought about method as integrated into impact generation. And I'm starting with this picture from one of our field sites. It's Wellatemba, which is part of a city called Worcester, which is about 2 hours out of Cape Town. And we're trying to understand why people are doing what they're doing with food, why they're making the choices they're making, how this is impacting their child nutrition. And just from this image, you can see we've got the advertising of the chicken company. We've got the fresh produce traders sitting outside. You've got the taxi rank sort of in operation. You've got the cash machines that dish out the grants that people get. All of these things are starting to interact. And so what we're trying to do is understand how these things come together in the lives of the research participants in order to understand why policies and programs work and don't work, where new opportunities might lay, and where opportunities might lay for improving that policy environment. Okay, so at the heart of this project, and as Karina was already saying, there's an underlying research ethos. You know, so many times we design a research methodology in terms of thinking about the kind of data and knowledge and information we're going to get out of it. But at the heart of this was really thinking about how that research process feeds into participant agency and feeds into policy impact. And so right at the beginning of the project, at the proposal stage, we were already working with the provincial government of the Western Cape, understanding what their needs were, trying to figure out what kind of data would help them with their decision-making process. So we're looking at the kind of research method as a really key component of a much wider set of engagements. At the core of it was this kind of being against the helicopter research, where researchers from the global north come into the global south, they extract data and disappear. But we're also aware that as researchers in South Africa, we're not immune from doing that within the communities that we work in too. And so there really was this effort, both by the City University team, but also the South African team, to think about how do we do research in an ethically responsible way? How do we ensure that in the process of doing research, we're creating durable research relationships in the field and with policymakers? And so I'll talk you through a little bit about what we've done and the role of the photos in the exhibition in all those phases of research. So we started this project, we got the funding before COVID, and then everything had to change. So we have an adapted methodology. And I think necessity being the mother of invention led us into some really productive pathways. So as you can see, we had a wide suite of methods. The first was led by Gareth Haysom, which was an intervention scan, really looking at all of the policies, programs, etc., from national government scale, provincial government scale, local government scale, that we felt shaped the experience of mothers trying to feed their children, and really demonstrating that the wide range of potential intervention spaces, but also the gaps and the silences in those processes. And so that was used in conjunction with the lived experience data that we got. We then did a series of in-depth interviews conducted telephonically that really honed in on food practices and spoke in depth with the participants about what they're doing with food, and then tried to make those linkages out to the systems. I led this WhatsApp process, which was something we hadn't intended to do, but worked, I think, phenomenally well. So during hard lockdown, and we had a very long hard lockdown in South Africa, we weren't allowed to go out into the field. But photographers who had journalistic licenses were able to go into the field. And so we commissioned a photographer called Sam Reinders to go and take photos for us that we would then be able to use in the research process. So she went into the 2 communities we worked in with one of my field workers to take photos that would help us to understand the state of the food environment, understand the state of social services, etc., in that moment, and use those in the WhatsApps. So we then created these 2 WhatsApp groups in 2 communities, about 15 participants each, and spent 3 weeks working with them, trying to understand their engagements with the food environment and food system, their engagement with the urban environment and urban systems, their engagement with social services. And in each of those, understanding how those things shaped what they were able to do in terms of food and nutrition for their children, in terms of keeping their children healthy. And so within this, and using photo elicitation, we started to build up these really quite rich narratives that showed these kind of systemic interconnections. We then took the initial findings back to the participants and asked them to reflect on what they thought were the most important learnings that came out. And so this work really focused on how the systems interacted and how they shape food practices. Mark then led a process of food environment mapping, because that was something the province felt was very important. And then we completed this photo exhibition that you will have seen the link to, and also a video and narrative that we created. And although in some senses this might appear to be a research output, it was also a very important research tool for kind of embedding the findings and moving into the next phase of the research. So it came down to this question of what kind of data did we need for the kind of impacts that we wanted to get. So in South Africa, there's a fairly extensive set of quantitative data, but it doesn't tell the richness of the narratives. It doesn't show systemic interconnections, and it creates often quite siloed policy approaches. So the things we needed to do was to understand the policy landscape, which is the intervention scan that Gareth did. We needed to generate data that was going to demonstrate those connections in order to make a case for transversal governance, in order to give tools to local and provincial government to enable them to do differently, to break out of silos, to start talking to each other. We also really needed to generate political will, because food and nutrition security in South Africa, and probably wherever you are, is often quite low on the policy and politics agenda. And so there was a need to create a compelling narrative that would generate political will, that would enable perhaps innovative governance approaches to emerge. And we also wanted to really enable community voices to be capacitated and amplified. And so that's how we kind of ended up with the approach we did, and some of the kind of core findings. So the first thing the research did, and the use of the photography as this kind of mode into the conversation, really made linkages across the systems evident. So in collecting these 3 weeks of kind of dialogue, we got a sense of what was going on. And so here we have a picture of a tripe seller in Zwelathemba. And the initial narrative was about how people like to buy the tripe because it's a traditional meal and it's not one that's readily available in the supermarket. So you have to buy from the informal traders. But then these stories about the connection between the butchers and the tripe and how they were selling kind of the fourth quarter meat through this very cheap distribution system. these narratives about, well, how actually you needed to be very careful where you bought from, because oftentimes the vendors weren't selling very well cleaned tripe because they were dependent on community standpipes, and they didn't have enough water to really make the tripe clean. Then there were concerns about, well, but if we buy it ourselves, then we can't keep it in the summer months because we don't have adequate refrigeration and our houses get too hot. We prefer to buy it from the traders, even though it might not be as clean, because we know it saves us then on water, which is a problem for us, and it saves us on the energy cost. And so how all these things around the services the state provides, the linkages to the formal system, the cultural diets that come through and which kinds of systems serve them, all of those linkages started to come through, and starts to help us to understand where a small intervention might make a large difference. The other thing about this approach was, because these women were in conversation with each other every day over the course of 3 weeks, we started to get a much richer understanding of this range of voices, range of experiences and perspectives, and telling a much more complex story than oftentimes a kind of focus group or individual interviews enable us to do. And then simply by spending 3 weeks with these women, we got additional insights into how life actually operated. So we had people turning up late because there'd been protest action around inadequate housing outside of a house all night. We had women who were WhatsApping from the clinic because their child was sick yet again and they had to spend the whole day in the clinic. There were women who were excusing themselves because they needed to try and find water for the day. And so, this process really helped us to understand those lived dynamics. We got a sense of, another set of key findings was this sense that, we often think, and planners and policymakers will have child-specific policies or general kind of urban planning types of policies and planning kind of interventions. But what came through in these narratives was that actually we have a fundamental challenge, that we're not creating safe spaces for children, and the kinds of spaces that are being created are particularly unsafe for children. So inadequate housing, inadequate energy provides conditions of unsafety in the house, where children are exposed to hot elements, where children can accidentally set fire to the house, as happened in our research group. We have inadequate waste collection and no safe places for children to play, and therefore children are playing in the waste dumps and getting sick. And so whatever food you're feeding them is for naught, because you have that chronic diarrhea that comes through. The dirty water that lays on the street, and how, again, that plays particular risks for children. So I think there's some really interesting things that started to come out. What also was important was the role that the research played in community empowerment. So we used community field liaisons from the communities we're working in order to help us as researchers to better understand the context we're working in, but also to legitimize our presence. What we found in conversation with the research participants, and also in their response to the exhibition, was that they had an increased understanding of the systemic drivers of food and nutrition insecurity. And, that they began to understand some of the structural challenges that they were experiencing and understand some of the interconnections. And this, in a way, gave people voice and agency. So in the Worcester, the Zwella-Temba case, at the top, there's a very small image that you probably won't be able to read. But Liesl Engelbrecht, one of the researchers, worked closely with some of the participants to co-author a newspaper article about how to encourage breastfeeding, really drawing on that lived experience. And so we're able to give voice to people in those specific ways. We also held learning journeys in Worcester, and if you're interested, I think Scott can talk to this, where we took officials from provincial government and municipal government to the site and worked with the participants before in order to enable them to speak to those officials, in order to really represent their voice effectively. And then finally, we've been running an ambassador program, which has managed to get separate funding, in which the participants from Masiphumelele have worked together to develop a much richer understanding of nutrition in a training program, but also getting training on storytelling, on advocacy, on understanding the linkages. And the image at the bottom you can see is from one of our first sessions, where the participants engaged the exhibition. They invited the ward councillor to come and listen to the experience, and then took decisions about what their pathway to action would be. And their first pathway to action was, in fact, to invite the City of Cape Town to meet with them, to help them better understand how to work with the informal traders to make sure they didn't get shut down for non-compliance. And so there was this kind of empowerment process that went through with this. And the exhibition that we're engaging with today was actually key to that process, to allow people to see themselves, to reflect on their experiences, and to create voice through that process. And then finally, we also then used the exhibition and the narratives to engage with policymakers. And this is just a kind of snapshot from the learning journey in Zwelettembe, where, like I said, officials from province and local government were taken into the site to meet with research participants, to spend 2 hours just talking through and experiencing their Zwelettembe. And as you can see, that the kind of post-reflection from the participants was this kind of recognition of the power of the exhibition, the recognition of the kind of complexity and the interactions of these processes, and the ways in which new ways of doing policy and programming should emerge. And what was also really crucial was, at the end, they were asked, so what would you want to share back with them, the residents of Zwelettembe? And just this recognition and this connection that they had heard and they'd seen, and they'd felt like they needed to do policy in a different way. This all sounds quite idealistic. And we know that as soon as people get back into the office, they fall back into their old silos. But there is something about the kind of cognitive shift that we've been able to precipitate through the use of this lived experience research and through the use of the exhibition. So I've got about 5 to 7 minutes left, and I think just want to open up for questions and comments before we get into really engaging with some of the material of the exhibition. So if there's anything anybody wants to ask about the research methods, the learning journey, the ambassador program, integration, use of photography, ethics, fire away, and we'll see what we can do in the next 5 to 7 minutes. Thanks, everyone. So I think raised hands or comments in the chat. Yeah, Claire.
Hi, thanks. Such a fascinating program. It's just really, really exciting to hear about it. It's, yeah, really, really kind of innovative ways that you dealt with COVID lockdowns. Really incredibly interesting to hear. I just wondered, just sort of on the last point that you were saying about, everyone hopefully not going back into their silos. I just wonder if you could comment about any sort of plans that you have for the future to sort of keep the connection alive between the different groups, and how you see that kind of durable partnership sort of continuing in the future.
Thanks, Claire. I'm actually going to throw Scott this question because Scott's driving quite a lot of that process, and there's two different things happening. So in Masiphumelele, the ambassadors program has gone through its first phase and has funding to carry on for the rest of the year. So there's some richness in that. And then in Worcester, there's been ongoing partnership through the provincial government of the Western Cape with another university, but I'm just going to open up that to Scott quickly, and then I'm going to get to Sweta's question. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Claire, thank you. As Jane says, in the Zwelettembe case, embedded in Worcester in the Breda Valley, processes unfolding very much where senior government officials and politicians, so some of the councillors, have been immersed in these learning experiences, connected to our provincial partners. And there's an agreement that on sort of mid or early next month, there will be a process of really taking stock of what those officials and those councillors have encountered and what they could and should be doing differently. So it's an iterative, ongoing process. It isn't an event, it isn't a couple of these learning journeys, but it's the sustained review and reflection that we hope that what we call prototypes will emerge, new ways of working with the systems, bringing together sectors, being very careful of the old solutions that we tend to sort of rework again and again, to really consider them more carefully. So that's an ongoing process. And then briefly with the ambassadors, it's, yes, the training that's happened in terms of understanding the system and perhaps some awareness and acknowledgement of nutrition, but it's also about the confidence and the agency to be able to go to the counsellor or go to a health official and to say, this is something that we need to be addressed, and to be able to then work with them in new and interesting ways. And so that, I think, is a reflection of the ongoing process. So that's just very briefly a quick response. Thanks, Jane.
Cool. And there's question on the ethics of the photography and a question on the community engagement process and identifying community partners. I'll take the community engagement process one first. So at the end of the research, like I said, we did approach all of the participants to get their reflections on the process, and then we held a series of internal workshops with the participants to talk through the findings, to help them distill what they felt the key messages were, and then took that into a wider set of engagements. In that process, we took on facilitators, and in Masiphumelele, the Cape Town case, the facilitator is based in the community. And so she's able to then draw on her networks to pull that in. So we really tried to enable the identification of community partners to be done by the research participants and facilitators in order to really kind of give that ownership over. So that's that process. There's a question about the ethics of the photography. So we did go through an ethical clearance process at City University, at Stellenbosch, and at UCT with these things. All of the people who were photographed gave their informed consent to have their photo taken and were advised on the potential usage of the imagery. We did not capture any imagery of identifiable children. And so that's really how that played out here. We have worked on inviting people to respond to the photos and react to the photos, and we've chosen the images we've chosen quite carefully in order to prevent some of the other challenges that might emerge with kind of the ethics of those photo processes. But I see we're at time, so Gareth, quickly, and then we'll hand back over to Scott for the next phase.
Thanks, Jane. I think it's also just to Smith's question around community engagement. I think also maybe just to mention, and others can counter, our engagement with community was not necessarily to speak to representatives of the entire community. It was by speaking to individuals who will speak to their own realities and their own needs and experiences. And so I think we've been quite careful in how we articulate and how we engage with the officials, that this isn't necessarily the voice of the entire community, because so often in our context, that is a fraught position, because there are who can then speak for the entire community. And so it's been very clear that when we're engaging, those participants that we're engaging with speak back to their own needs and their own, as almost as individuals rather than as the community, whatever that term might be, if that clarifies something on that as well.
Jane, Gareth, yeah, thank you very much. So colleagues, we've got a chance now to really dive deep into a learning process for an hour. And we're going to break into 6 groups. Each of the groups is going to have a facilitator who's a member of our team. And it'll be an opportunity to embark upon, I guess, a learning journey in itself. So we're going to be looking at some of the exhibition. We're going to be following a set of questions. We're going to be really diving deep into understanding what it is that's been revealed by the imagery, but also by some of the quotes from research participants. And we're threading these things together. And so very much the onus is going to be on very small groups, which I think is fantastic. 4 or 5 with a facilitator, an opportunity to really talk and engage. And that's an invitation to everyone. Before the learning journey happened in Worcester, a very, very senior official who sits in provincial level spoke across to all of his colleagues, officials with large budgets, with a lot of power, and appealed to them in embarking upon this journey to listen twice and to talk once. So very much shifting this dynamic in terms of coming into a process, coming into a place, and not telling or coming with the solutions, but rather immersing, listening, taking time to understand. And this is also the invitation we have here. When we engage with the images and the quotes, to really engage, to allow yourself to empathize, to become embedded, and then to engage with the questions. So that really is the opportunity that we have. So we'll have an hour, and then after that hour, we'll come back into plenary with a relatively short reflection, and then we'll wrap it up. And Julia, if I could turn to you to perhaps set us up in terms of the breakout groups. Thanks very much. Right, well, thank you and welcome back. I hope that was a positive experience, something where learning really did take place. Certainly from my point of view, I really did enjoy the interaction a great deal, and was certainly, I learned very much from colleagues who engage with the images and the quotations with very different ways, from very different contexts and positions. And I think it was a very powerful experience for me. So just to say thank you to my group, but I think also just generally to all of you for engaging. So we've got around 15 minutes or so just to have a general reflection about that experience, and to hone in on that last question that we asked about if we are embarking upon this lived experience research, and our intention is very clear about shifting towards healthier diets. As a depiction of that lived experience, what are those images and the connection and overlay of those images tell you about the needed response to enable a shift to a healthier diet, and with a particular emphasis on children, caregivers within households? That was the last question that we posed, and it would be good to hear from as many people as possible just about that, and about then a general reflection back onto the lived experience process. So we could use the hand function, or you could just speak into the recording as you wish. And I may, in fact, draw you in if I don't get a reaction. Anyone? Certainly, I would encourage my group to share. Certainly, there were a few insights that I really did appreciate, that I think would be very valuable for everyone. Joe, thank you.
Hi, Scott. Hi. Thanks, everyone, for such a really fascinating and inspiring session. I was with Jane, actually, and Rusmi and some others in our group, and we had a really nice conversation. But one of the things that struck me about this is that as researchers, we're so used to seeing like static conceptual frameworks with like arrows all over the place pointing, to like causes and, stuff of drivers of problems. But I think seeing this work presented in this way by people who are living these experiences brings it much more to life and helps you to see. It's almost like being part, in those arrows, it's sort of in the 3D sort of world of it, and it really brings to life how multifaceted the challenge of diets and nutrition are, and the many different angles with which you could, how complex it is, but also, on the other hand, how many different ways there are to try and intervene, through with policy. So yeah, thanks for helping me see that.
Yeah, that's great. And hopefully reinforces, I think, much of what the ANH is about bringing these intersections together, making them explicit. Yeah. Thanks, Joe. Sweta, will you forgive me if I draw you in or invite you to speak in terms of, I think a very powerful reflection at the end in terms of your sense of whether this type of process builds commitment. I don't want to put you on, of course, I am putting you on the spot, but I'm doing it with as much grace as I can.
No, that's fine, Scott. It's more, the smiling is not necessarily being put on the spot, more so that I felt it was a bit of a Debbie Downer, but I think the process and the method is very powerful for the reason alone, which is to give voice to the communities that all of this work is about, right? And if that is the only reason that the work is done, I think, or this kind of method is utilized alone, that reason alone is very powerful, in my opinion. Having said that, I also was thinking about, for many of us that might either be living in these contexts that we study or are quite, often engaged in it. Some of the pictures are not entirely we're in it all the time. We're in it. The political leaders are in it. They're complex and chaotic and reveal all kind of inequities that many of us who are living in those contexts might, be privy to on a daily basis. And so my question, or what I was grappling with, is just like, what does it take to create political will? Because I don't know if a picture where you can see so clearly issues of access to electricity and clean water and all kinds of restrictions that people face on a daily basis. Is it enough? Is it that we need to combine this kind of process with other types of evidence, but like also provide a clearer narrative? Is it that more constant engagement with participants who or with the people, with the communities producing this kind of research, right? Taking the actual photos and giving voice to those photos. Does that need to be done more often? I was just thinking a lot about that, because it feels like people know, and yet we're just stuck in this space. And also that last point of just the issues of food just don't seem to be very little to do with healthy food. It's a systemic issue that we're facing about, being able to provide healthy diets to people, or healthy lifestyles and nutritious foods to people. I'll stop there.
Sweta, thank you very much. And I would encourage even the research team just to react and respond to that as well. I think it's a fair challenge in terms of what it is to build that active citizenship, or to enable that change, that shift, to really enable that change. Jasmine, if I could draw you in. There you go.
Hi. Clicking mute didn't work. So it was the person who asked the question earlier about ethics, and your comments about lived experience just really made me think about what is underlying the question that I asked, which is that I feel like when you start to do, particularly for something participatory, start to go through the process of navigating ethics, a lot of it seems focused not just on not doing harm and rigidly defining what we mean by harm, but also on the more a group is identified as a quote vulnerable group, the more it becomes about reducing liability and making sure that universities are shielded from that as much as anything. And I just think that so often we get so focused on defining who's at risk and defining harm and defining vulnerability that we sometimes silence voices that actually there's an ethical imperative also to represent those voices. So just thinking about this in that context really has made me think about how we have those discussions about ethics and balancing not wanting to do harm with actually wanting to make sure that we're not silencing people as well. Thanks.
Jasmine, thank you very much. That's well appreciated. And again, to my colleagues, if you'd like to respond, please do. Certainly, I think that's another powerful question, challenge around ethics. Yeah, I mean, would anyone like to react to any of those 2 points? Political commitment, what does it take? Lived experience, but also, this very clear ethical challenge that, this type of research faces, and the importance of that. So, yeah. Yes, Claire, and I see Lizanne would like to respond as well. But Claire, let me invite you, and then to get Lizanne to make a response. Claire.
I just wanted to, building on what Yasmin just asked, from your perspective, do you have any examples of where you really felt like, you perhaps couldn't access certain communities, or do you have any kind of feeling of specific groups of people that you really had to miss because of the process and because of the ethics behind this?
Thanks, Claire. It's, again, just building, I think, very much on Jasmine's position. Lizanne, you would like to respond on this, and
Yes, thank you, Scott. And thanks, Jasmine, for raising that specific thought. I'll get to the ethics response now, but I want to also just mention one response that came from the group where I was in, around what does it take to garner the political will and how do we address this issue? Like multisectoral interventions came up, of course, as the answer to that, but how do we do that? And the one comment was that the more sectors we involve in the research, like you explained and Jane also mentioned the learning journeys, and how these sectors then come together, the role players come together. So the comment was that if we involve them in the research, then more of the sectors could be in the same room, could discuss the interventions, so more and more multi-sectoral actions could flow from the research itself. And I think that has been some of the conversations that we have had as a group about this specific methodology and what then flowed from it. So I think that was a very nice comment. The comment on ethics is, of course, if we load or upload a protocol to our ethics system, if you click on research for children or with children, then a whole new section opens up that you have to complete. And it takes so long, and there's so much that you have to populate in that specific section that it actually deters you from doing research with children, and then also, as you mentioned, with very vulnerable groups. So absolutely, that is true. And then you have to ask the question, if it's made so difficult through the ethics process, who do we exclude eventually? So in our case, we didn't do research with the children, on the children. I don't want to really use the word on, it doesn't sound right. But we didn't involve children in the research, but it was about children. So it was the caregivers, etc., that spoke on behalf of and that was involved with the questioning and so forth. But I absolutely agree that sometimes it's made so difficult, the ethics processes for engaging with certain groups, that we don't really want to go there. And that shouldn't be like that. So we had a research discussion meeting earlier this morning in our faculty around transformation of research. And that was one of the issues that came up, is how do we streamline these processes, not to make it easier, because obviously you need to go through those processes. There are certain questions that you need to answer when it comes to ethics, but it shouldn't exclude groups just because it's such a laborious process.
Thank you, Lizanne. That's great. And Steph, I see your question, but before I bring you in, I'd just like to invite Jane just to respond in terms of a comment about political will, something that I know you've been grappling with a great deal throughout this process, but with other work as well. So Jane, just to draw you in, and then I recognize Steph and Lupa for your questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think on political will, we were in an incredibly fortunate position at the start of the project. So like I said, we generated the project with the provincial government of the Western Cape, and we've had this kind of long-term process of engagement with both province, City of Cape Town, and the Zans Group have had long-term engagement with Worcester. And so we're partly entering into a terrain where there was a degree of interest from the officials, but not from the politicians. And so there has been this process of thinking about how we use this kind of research to do it. And we were told by province that what you need to do is make a story, is to have this a compelling narrative, to let them see the real people. And so, I mean, I think your point that they see it every day, but there's cognitive dissonance and they don't see the connections. And there's almost a willful, what's the word Gareth always uses? There's almost a willful blindness to these processes. And so doing things like the learning journey, where you actually are compelled to go in and to listen and to see and to forget about your existing mandate, your disciplinary training, I think was incredibly powerful at allowing people to actually see what they see every day. And so I think there's an element of that. I also have to say that the timing of our project, the food security crisis that emerged as a result of COVID, actually, I think, enabled the officials to have some mobility to get policymakers and politicians to think seriously about these things. So I think there was an element of that. And just in terms of what we were missing, our selection criteria was caregivers who had children under 5 who qualified for the child support grant. And that automatically excluded a lot of the foreign-born children and foreign parents, and they have their own particular vulnerabilities. So I think in our criteria, we probably also neglected some crucial groups in there. Thanks.
Jane, thank you very much. So just to invite Steph and Nalupa just to pose your questions, perhaps your reflection a little bit if you want to talk about responses. And I am watching time, so I'm going to ask you both just to speak, and then we'll get a reaction response and then move towards wrapping up. So
Cool,
Steph,
yeah, that was great.
You.
Thanks, everyone. It was just a quick one just to ask, you talked about working more with the community and them obviously understanding the drivers more to do with the drivers of health, and for them to advocate for them more. And I just wondered if the project had any engagement or plans to continue engaging with whether it's the ECDs or the local community.
Great, thank you. I'm sure someone will respond to that. And Nalupa, if I could invite you.
Sure, and apologies for my video here, but I guess there were 3 things I was kind of thinking about from a really wonderful discussion that we had. And one was a little bit related to what Swetha had mentioned about how we're so immersed in the environments that we work in, and how much we've come to accept as normal. And I think that poses the challenges for us as researchers as well, is that, for example, I think the example I gave in the discussion was injuries of children due to cooking and fire and access to fuel and all of that is something that that higher degree of risk is a thing that we are so used to. And so it's not always communicated, and it's hard to say like how this shouldn't be and needs to change. I thought that the multi-sectoral approach, or the systems approach, the integrated systems approach, was really nice because it does show how different sectors need to respond, but it's hard to make those connections to other sectors to say that if you're working in water or energy, how that affects food, and to communicate that well, and for people who are working in energy to feel any motivation to make changes that would improve food security. And I also really appreciated the discussion on agency, that it's hard in contexts like these to really ask people to have behavior change when they have so much of these other external structural things that make it so difficult. I appreciated in our group Karina's comment as well, that agency is not just for adults but also for children, and that they should have the right to choices, however small, even if it's just selecting the type of sweets that they want to buy. I think that's important.
Yeah, thank you so much for those comments. I think there's a lot to gain in those. So Steph, you raised a direct question about ongoing sort of advocacy of the research. So just again, invitation to the research team just to perhaps reflect a bit on that, and perhaps commentary about the ambassadors or other work. So that's an invitation. And Nalupa, I think your point just about agency, but also that systems approach and how it enables different sectors to respond. Gareth, maybe you could speak a little bit around the intervention scan. So yeah, Karina, thank you for responding.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, we had a group meeting back in April in Cape Town, and what was interesting about where our discussion went was that we spent most of the time talking about how to take the results of this study forward to encourage political commitment and action, and whether it be particular in the ECD space or in other spaces. And a lot of it came down in the end to thinking about what kind of governance structures are needed. That was one strand in order to make these kinds of decisions. And that, of course, is an old discussion about how you get people working together. But also, it was kind of grappling with just how hard it is to expect this place-based approach, which we're essentially advocating for here, and the intensity and intention that is needed to take this kind of approach is just not, it's just not the usual way of doing things. So there's a whole piece of work that needs to be done on process. And what this study, I think, does is it starts to say, well, what do we need to do differently if we're really going to tackle the problem? Like, if we're really going to tackle this problem, these are the things we need to do. And these are the systems that we need to change. And so I think it advances on perhaps more one-dimensional understandings of the problem and reducing it just to one or two things. But what it doesn't really do yet is to then say, what are the next steps? But we are in process of that through the process of engaging the community in the ambassador scheme, and this is all being led by the members of the team, and Scott in particular in the learning journeys, and Jane mentioned those earlier. But we recognise that we are only experimenting to try and understand how to be, having done this research, and then what it means to translate that into action. And at the meeting we had the feedback, well, just tell us what your top 3 recommendations are. So we're dealing with a system that's what it wants, and that's what resonates with it, and not the person we're working with directly in the government of the Western Cape, but beyond that. So I think it's almost like we need to have research that actually kind of looks at that process and gives researchers the space to really do that properly, and that engagement process properly. We're doing it gratis now. Our research funds are finished. So I'm just really glad these points have come up, and it's something that we're grappling with for sure. Over.
Thank you, Karina. So we are reaching the end of our process, and we do need to wrap it up. Gareth, if you would like a 30-second slot to talk about.
I think Karina's mentioned it anyway, and it's. I think she said that in terms of that. So let me leave it and park that there. Thanks very much, Gareth. And just again, one of the catalogue's exhibitions has this superb set of interventions that are overlaid with that. And just to draw you to that, those were shared earlier on, and in terms of some of the learning. So with that, Karina, I'd like to turn to you just to perhaps take us to a close, and maybe from some final thoughts from yourself as we wrap up this Learning Lab.
Sure, I'll just already spoke, of course, just then, so we'll be brief. First of all, thank you very much indeed to the participants for your engagement. I'm sure that all of the facilitators from the team in the groups learned a lot from you and from your reactions to the photos, so very grateful for that. What I guess I'd like you all to do and to think about now is, what will you do differently now as a result of this learning process? Is there something that you can do differently in your role, in whatever position that you are in the work that you do, and perhaps to think about what that might look like, and then what kind of support you need to doing those things differently? Because at the end of the day, we need to have a different setup in our research, in the work that we do, that enables and makes this kind of work more acceptable as a rigorous and robust process that provides important insights into how to address the profound dietary inequalities in our world today. So my ending note is a challenge to you all. What will you do differently? What support do you need? And if you want to follow up with the team afterwards to say what kind of support that you'd need, that would be very interesting for us to understand that, and help us try to create an environment in which this kind of research can be taken more seriously and used to inform policy and practice. So thank you very much to everyone, and thanks very much to the team, and particularly to Scott for leading on the development of this this session today. Thank you.